Okay, so let's unpack this. We are diving into what's arguably the single biggest transformation in advanced nursing practice prep in, well, decades.
Mm.
We're talking about the move to the Doctor of Nursing Practice, the DNP.
Yeah, it's absolutely pivotal. And, while shifting from a master's to a doctorate sounds maybe a bit academic on the surface, our sources really show this is about giving advanced practice nurses the tools for scientific translation and application. It's less about pure discovery, more about using the science we have.
That's a key distinction, isn't it?
Yeah.
Translation versus discovery. That's really the lens we need to use today. So our mission is to track how the DNP evolved in the U.S. We'll look at its maybe surprising history, what really drove that big 2004 decision, and how it's being adopted now, sometimes with a bit of tension.
Exactly. And what's fascinating, I think, is that the DNP feels very modern, right? Like a response to today's complex healthcare. But when you trace it back, it's almost like nursing trying to reclaim its roots. Its original identity as a high-level practice discipline. It's kind of a return to form, in a way.
A return to form.
Hmm.
Okay, so to understand that, we need to dig into those deeper roots of doctoral practice in nursing. It wasn't all PhDs before 2004, was it? The sources mention quite a few different practice-focused doctorates that came before.
That's absolutely right, yeah. Before the DNP became the sort of endorsed standard, you had professional doctorates like the ED, the Doctor of Education. You also had the clinical doctorate, the DNS, Doctor of Nursing Science, and even a more specialized Doctor of Nursing, the ADD. These existed alongside the research-focused PhD.
Hmm. So that variety suggests this tension, the one between research in the lab and practice at the bedside. It's always been there. I noticed one source pointed to an ADD from way back in 1933 at Teachers College, Columbia University, and framed it specifically as a practice doctorate.
Yes. That 1933 date is really important. It sets a historical precedent. It shows the DNP isn't totally out of left field. It aligns with how the ADD was seen globally professional, focused on application. And you also had early research programs popping up around the same time. NYU started its PhD in nursing in 1934. University of Pittsburgh followed in 54 with a PhD program that, interestingly, already had a clinical focus mixed with research.
Right, and then Boston University launched the DNS in 1960, specifically for psychiatric mental health practice. So the idea of highly educated nurses focused on practice leadership isn't new at all, decades old. But the sources seem to hint at something deeper, like a historical wrong turn that the DNP is trying to correct now.
Exactly. You really have to understand how nursing education itself changed, especially after Florence Nightingale set up her model. That context is crucial for seeing why the DNP push happened when it did.
Okay, this part I found really interesting because the shift away from academic focus wasn't driven by some grand theory, but by something really basic. Poor funding. Basically, the Nightingale ideal got watered down because it was expensive.
That's the core of it. The Nightingale Model, which was about structured, hospital-based training, it got Americanized, as one source put it, mostly because the funding structures weren't there to support it properly. So education shifted from placing students in hospitals for learning to using them more for, well, ward service, cheap labor.
Which meant less classroom time, right? Less theory. And practical experience became the main teacher, but maybe not in a structured educational way, more like learning on the fly based on staffing needs.
Precisely. And then logistics made it worse. Hospitals started popping up everywhere in the 1870s. They needed nurses fast. Student nurses filled that gap. But this huge demand led to a diffusion, kind of a watering down, of educational quality and standards. Academic foundations often got sacrificed for service hours.
Wow. So the DNP isn't just about aiming higher now. It's almost like trying to claw back that academic rigor and the systems-level thinking that got lost over a century ago when education became more about just filling shifts.
Right. It's an attempt to reintegrate that deeper theoretical understanding with practical application at a high level. So if the problem started way back then with losing rigor to service demands, what happened in the early 2000s? What was the specific pressure point that finally made the profession say, okay, we need to fix this?
Good question. And that takes us right into the momentum phase. The official decision to go doctor for advanced practice, the date everyone points to, is October 25th, 2004.
That's the one. That was the day the American Association of Colleges of Nursing, the AACN, formally voted. They endorsed their position statement on the practice doctorate in nursing, basically saying advanced practice prep needs to move from the master's level to the doctorate level.
That's a huge decision. I mean, it impacts hundreds of thousands of nurses eventually. What were the main reasons? The core drivers that made them say, we have to do this now?
Well, it really boils down to complexity. The number one driver cited again and again is the changing demands of healthcare itself. The whole system was getting incredibly complex, and the idea was that nurses needed the absolute highest level of scientific knowledge and practice know-how to actually deliver quality patient outcomes in that environment.
So the big picture complexity.
Yeah.
But I think the sources also mention specific crises fueling this, like concerns about patient safety. Was the feeling that master's preparation just wasn't enough anymore to manage the risks in modern healthcare systems?
That was definitely a major part of the argument. The sheer volume of knowledge underpinning practice was expanding so fast. The science, the evidence base, it basically outgrew what you could reasonably pack into a traditional master's program. You needed more focus on things like systems thinking, translating evidence into practice quickly, quality improvement methodologies, and those are really the hallmarks of a practice doctorate like the DNP.
Okay, but hang on. The sources also mentioned shortages, right? Shortages of nursing staff and faculty. Doesn't mandating a doctorate potentially make those shortages worse, at least in the short term? Isn't it a barrier?
That's the inherent tension, absolutely. The sources acknowledge the personnel shortages. They talk about needing leaders who can design and assess care, but they also point to a critical shortage of doctorally prepared nursing faculty. So the DMP was seen in part as a way to tackle that faculty shortage too, by creating more clinically focused, doctorally prepared nurses who could then teach practice effectively.
So it's trying to solve two problems at once, build clinical leadership and build the faculty pipeline. But yeah, you can see how that might create some short-term strain. And importantly, this wasn't just nursing deciding this internally, right? There was external validation for this shift.
Oh, absolutely critical point. This wasn't just the ACN talking to itself. You had the National Academy of Sciences in a big 2005 report looking at health professions education. They specifically called for nursing to develop a non-research clinical doctorate to prepare expert practitioners and clinical faculty. That's a direct endorsement of the DNP concept.
Wow. And when you see names like the National Academy of Medicine, what used to be the Institute of Medicine, plus the Joint Commission, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, when all these major bodies are talking about rethinking health professional education, you realize this DNP move was part of a much larger system-wide push for higher standards.
Exactly. It wasn't happening in a vacuum. The momentum was there, and the profession really did mobilize. Since that 2004 statement, over 96,000 nurses have graduated with a DNP. Think about that number. That scale of adoption in under 20 years is pretty remarkable.
96,000.
Yeah.
That's not just a number. Like you said, that's generations of advanced practice leaders, leaders trained in a fundamentally different way, focused on systems and evidence translation. And the professional organizations, they're putting deadlines in place to make this the standard, aren't they?
They are, yeah, really pushing it forward. Take nurse anesthetists, the CRNAs, their accrediting body. The Council on Accreditation of Nurse Anesthesia Educational Programs set a 2025 deadline for doctoral education for entry into practice. But get this, as of January 1st, 2022, every single new student entering a CRNA program was already required to be in a doctoral program. So for them, it's basically already happened. The standard is effectively doctorate level now.
Wow. Okay, so CRNAs are already there. What about nurse practitioners?
Similar direction, the National Organization of Nurse Practitioner Faculties, NONPF, they called for the DNP to be the entry-level degree for NPs by 2025. And they just reaffirmed that position last year in April 2023. So the push is definitely still on.
The direction seems pretty clear then. And wasn't there a study, Rand Corporation, that looked at this?
Yes. The 2014 RAND study, it found, and this is a direct quote basically, near universal agreement among nurse educators. Agreement that the DNP provides valuable preparation for advanced nursing practice roles.
Okay, near universal agreement among educators is strong. But, with any change this big, there's bound to be some friction, some internal debate. The sources mentioned this conflict, didn't they, between the professionalizers pushing for the DNP and maybe traditionalists?
Yes, and that internal friction is really important to acknowledge. It's not all smooth sailing. The DNP is focused on the future standard, but the profession has a huge existing workforce of highly skilled nurses trained at the master's level. And the sources stress, we need to learn from history, like that dilution of the Nightingale Model we talked about.
Yeah.
The key is to avoid disenfranchising these experienced advanced practice nurses.
Disenfranchising, meaning making sure that NPs, nurse midwives, CRNAs, clinical nurse specialists who are already practicing, often with decades of experience, making sure they still feel valued and supported even as the entry ticket changes for the new folks coming in.
Exactly. It's that classic balancing act, isn't it? How do you push for academic advancement and higher standards while also respecting and supporting the incredibly valuable, experienced workforce you already have who trained under the previous system? That's a delicate line nursing leadership has to walk right now.
So if we try to synthesize all of this,
Yeah.
what's the bottom line on the DMP? It's fundamentally a non-research clinical doctorate, right? Designed specifically because healthcare got so complex, the science expanded so much that a new level of preparation was needed.
That's the core takeaway, I think. Its purpose is to create leaders at the system level. Leaders who can take all that cutting-edge scientific knowledge, the stuff the PhD researchers might discover, synthesize it, evaluate it, and most importantly, translate it effectively into practice in these really complex care environments, making sure the evidence actually reaches the bedside and improves patient care. That's the goal.
Application, translation, systems thinking. That seems to be the mantra. So the DMP emerges as this direct response to the complexities of 21st century healthcare. We've traced its historical roots, why it became necessary, the big 2004 push, and the massive adoption since then, including those ongoing tensions. Okay, so we always like to leave you, our listener, with something to chew on, a provocative thought. Given that the rapid expansion of medical knowledge was such a key driver for the DMP, what other mechanisms, beyond just formal education like the DMP, might healthcare systems need? Mechanisms to ensure that all clinical leaders across all disciplines, not just nursing, can effectively and rapidly translate that exploding scientific evidence into better bedside practice. How do we make sure the system itself supports continuous learning and application for everyone? That's something to think about.
That's a great question to ponder, and thank you for providing the material for this deep dive today. It was fascinating to explore.
Absolutely. And thank you all for listening. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.